little sign up.
I'm so close to that for the job. This loves to die on me.
Yeah, my battery's not great now.
Likes to die on me and I'm like,
I was thinking we'll get an Apple one, but
Oh, they're so expensive. For what? Just get them second hand and then like,
and then
yeah.
I've had a Mac before.
well, they got me to do, I've got to do live workout from my laptop in December, and the laptop camera, it's not,
Oh.
but apparently Macs are better.
I have no idea. I really wanted a Mac and then I like literally scratched the itch by just getting Apple stick and put it off the back of my laptop and then I was like, oh, I feel better now, like I don't need one. It was literally just like a superficial thing in my brain for a while.
And then my dad gave me the option, you could upgrade it or he doesn't, and I'm just like,
Yeah.
the Mac was driving me nuts.
Right, we'll make a start then if that's all right. Good morning. I know there's maybe one more person to come that's on their way in at the moment. Now, I know you've got an assignment that's due in on Friday, I think, this week. Kind of looking at different constructs of childhood potentially. So I don't know whether anything we look at today is relevant towards that in any way at all. But the main message, I suppose, from this morning is that we're going to think a little bit about kind of ALN and SEN. We're going to think a little bit about people's perspectives towards ALN and SEN and how that impacts upon children and young people's perspectives and their experiences and their outcomes. And my feeling, for what it's worth, and it's only my feeling, is having worked in education for quite a long time now, I qualified back in 1996, so I'm an old man, was that there were a lot of children potentially who were stunted in terms of where they were able to develop to because of people's perspectives towards them and how they were treated, rather than necessarily as a result of needs that they displayed. And I was just earwigging then when you were talking about the behaviour unit you were in last week. Worked in one of those units for a decade, and that was very much my experience there as well, was that all these learners have been kind of given up on by anywhere else, for good reason in some cases, because they made it challenging. Good morning. But very much people's perspectives towards them had influenced kind of where they ended up, I think. So that's kind of what we're going to look at this morning. I'm going to be trying to be quite ambitious in terms of what we're going to think about. Now, the first bit is quite basic, and many of you may well be quite ahead in terms of this anyway. But we're just going to do a quick introduction for those of you that aren't aware in terms of ALN in Wales. We're going to think a little bit about the kind of the definition itself. I think we possibly saw that with the session with Jackie the other week. I can't remember what I mentioned that day, but we might have looked at that definition before. We'll think a little bit about different models of disability. So again, you've probably come across the medical and social models of need in particular, and how those influence perceptions of needs. We're going to focus a little bit on labels, so the different types of labels learners have been given over time, and are there advantages and disadvantages of that. And then we're going to focus a little bit on some contentious areas potentially. And I've just picked on two really, where I suppose there's no right answer, and I suppose it depends very much on the individual and the setting they find themselves in. Is possibly one of the biggest areas of support we give to learners with ALN is the use of teaching assistants. Now, I've been a teaching assistant myself. I've worked with teaching assistants over the years, and there's all sorts of debate in the literature as to whether that is beneficial or not. And I'm going to show you a report later on which I think is a little bit damning really in terms of the impact of teaching assistants. However, I don't think it's damning in terms of the individuals doing the role, rather how they are asked to work, or how they're deployed, or how they're supported or not by the schools that they work in. So we're going to have a look at that briefly, and then we're also going to think a little bit about inclusion. So we've all got our own, I suppose, perceptions of inclusion. all sorts of different definitions of what that means in practice. And we're going to think a little bit about potentially some of those learners you mentioned on Friday, for example. What do we do with those learners perhaps whose schools feel that it's hard to include them? And we'll think a little bit about where learners with ALN should be taught. So we're going to think a little bit about, is there a justification, if we want inclusive education, to have some children taught separately in special units or special schools, for example, as when we look at some definitions that would suggest these learners are being segregated because they're being separated and sent somewhere else because the perception is they're different. However, having worked in alternative provisions, I don't know whether I necessarily agree with all of that. And my feeling is, and again, just my feeling for what it's worth, a lot of those learners do find themselves being included, although we can't get away from the fact that they're still in a separate setting somewhere else. So maybe they're included in a segregated setting, which doesn't quite make sense, but that's kind of where we're going. So I think I might have said some of this bump already last week, so I'm not going to kind of go through it as I'm not the most interested in the people anyway, but realistically I started off as a secondary school teacher, started off teaching geography and history and a little bit of Welsh, and found out very, very quickly that I wasn't really interested in the curriculum, to be honest. A lot of what we had to teach was quite boring. A lot of what we had to teach very much was, well, it might come up in the exams, we've got to teach it because it could be on the exam. And I didn't really like that aspect of it, but what I did really like was the working with children and young people side of it. And in particular, the learners that I really liked working with were those learners who perhaps were a little bit invisible in school. So they were the ones that no one else really bothered with that much. They weren't perhaps the high flyers, they weren't the ones that other people were perhaps a bit more excited about. So just to give you an example, and this was the words that my head of department said to me when I started at this school, his particular words were, when he was deciding who was going to teach what class, he went, I'm not interested in those learners who aren't going to get an A star in their GCSEs. So I'm going to have those classes. And his phrase, which has stuck by me for the last 30 years, is, you can have the rest of the mongs and the drongs, which I thought was very nice. So that was his kind of perception as to who we wanted to work with and why. I went to work then in a behaviour support unit, in a pupil referral unit, which I did for 10 years, which I loved for 90% of the time. I thought it was great. And realistically then, these were learners who'd been excluded from mainstream school and had been excluded from a pupil referral unit as well. And we were the last kind of place in the line after us. There was nowhere else for these learners to go. And the aim of a pupil referral unit, they're called short stay schools in England as well, for example, suggests that these learners will stay in a unit for a short specified period of time, and then they will reintegrate back into mainstream school. And we'll touch on that at the end of this morning as well, about that terminology. We're asking children to reintegrate, we're not asking schools to re-include them, which I think is a big difference. So I did that for a bit, and then went up and taught at Glyndŵr University, as I was at the time, up in Wrexham. So I used to teach on all sorts of different education courses, including training people to be specialist dyslexia teachers and assessors, for example. And then I've been here at Swansea, this is my 4th year now, in terms of that. So that's kind of where I've come from. And I think I went into teaching very naive 22-year-old, didn't really know much about anything, knew how volcanoes worked, didn't know how children worked, and I found that out very quickly. But as I said, what I really enjoyed was working with children rather than working with a subject. So just very, very briefly, I'm not going to ask you to spend too much time in terms of this, but I've got a few Padlet links on here that we're going to go through today, and I'm just going to ask you to pop some information on if you're happy to do so. Now, when you click on these, it'll give you some kind of anonymous normally animal themed name. So the Courageous Gecko was a nice one from last week I had, for example. So all I'd ask you to do, very, very briefly, if you're happy to do so, the QR code should work, famous last words. If you've got the PowerPoint open on your device, the Padlet link does work. And I've also popped these up on the additional resources page for this week as well, so you can access it straight on there. So what I'd like you to think about, do you have any particular experiences in relation of ALN SEN? So that could be working with learners in a school or college setting, for example. This could be you've got family members who have a diagnosed or identified need. I'm not quite sure what I'm asking you to put in terms of this next one, but I've put personal perspectives. So I'm going to leave that kind of open because I don't really know what I want you to say in terms of this. So what are your personal perspectives in terms of ALN SEN? So it could be, do you know what, all learners should be taught in the same school, or there should be special units for those learners who need them, or learners with ALN don't always get the support they need, but there's reasons for that. And then I'm going to ask you to think a little bit about, do you have any kind of self-identified areas of strength? So do you know what? I've spent some time working with these types of learners and I think I know quite a bit about supporting that. Or I have a younger brother who is autistic and therefore I've picked up those skills. And then is there anything you'd like to develop further? So is there any particular area of need that you find more challenging than others? So I've got to be honest, despite this is my 30th year working in education now, I've never really worked with children who have kind of a multi-sensory impairment. So a visual and or a hearing impairment. I wouldn't really know what to do if I was parachuted into a class with such learners. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to pop some stuff on there, and then what we'll do then we'll kind of get going a little bit more into the content. And hopefully as we go through, as long as I don't bang on too much this morning, there's going to be a few little activities that I'm going to ask you to do. The other ones we're going to do, you can either do them in pairs or individually or as a group of 4, whatever works best for you. Whilst you're doing that, I'm just going to set a timer on my phone to remember to give you a break later, because I will forget. So, one post up on it already, somebody typing very fast. Thank you very much for posting that.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can see the flames coming off the keyboard there. Nice, thank you. So that's a really nice range of experience. So a few more coming through now, thank you very much. So one-to-one TA and teaching experience different areas of need, in particular in relation to things like cognition and learning and dyslexia and ASD, in terms of communication and interaction. Thinking about perspectives, okay, so all children should be able to be supported in mainstream school, okay, but maybe this doesn't happen in reality. Okay, so maybe we're trying to fit children into a system that wasn't initially designed to have these children and young people as part of it. Okay, so a nice point, thank you very much. Really like this second one, they are amazing. Alright, so there's no one blueprint for individuals. Okay, every individual I meet, I learn more. I think that's a fantastic point. Okay, one of the things we have, I think, in terms of, we'll look at labels a little bit later on, is kind of seeing everyone with that label as having similar needs and challenges, rather than seeing the learner holistically behind that label. So, thank you for posting. Okay, a little bit more experience coming in as well. So again, people working on a one-to-one basis, done some work experience, have siblings with a particular area of need, so have kind of personal experience of that. Okay, and then maybe a little bit lesser in terms of experience, but again thinking about family members needing support. Okay, so thinking about the perspectives again, so all learners should be in mainstream, but it's difficult. All learners are individual. All learners are unique. They have different ways of dealing with things and different ways of thinking, and again their settings that they engage with are all unique as well. So maybe those two individual learners who are dyslexic go into two different schools. They will bring their own different areas of strengths and challenges and interests, and also the environment in those schools will have an impact as well. Okay. And then finally, areas of strength, so building positive relationships, making learners feel welcome. So I think those 2 points probably are the most key in terms of supporting inclusion in schools. Okay, understanding from personal and family experiences, brilliant. Okay, and that's an interesting point in terms of knowing more about screening for needs. So I've worked with learners for needs, but I'm not quite sure potentially how that's been identified or how that diagnostic process works, or maybe what my role in that process is. And we'll come back to that point later as well. So thank you very much for sharing those. I'm going to give you a final 30 seconds or so because people are still typing, and then I'll move on. But key things, I suppose, I really wanted to get out to that first bit is, what are your opinions, what are your perspectives? Okay, so these learners see the world differently, and maybe we need to adapt our world so that they see, or that, you know, see it in similar ways. Learners are unique, and maybe all learners should be in mainstream school, but it's difficult. Okay, so there's quite a few things there that we're going to come back to, which we'll pick up this morning as well. So thank you very much for posting those. Now, in Wales, over the last few years, teachers have gone through what was seen as two once-in-a-generation changes in education at the same time. So we've had the new curriculum for Wales, for example, where underpinning the new curriculum was the aim for all learners' needs to be met and to support inclusion. And then we've also moved away from a shared SEN system with England to our own ALM system in Wales. Both of those came in at similar times. Not surprisingly, when we think about politics, potentially neither of those systems were developed jointly. So they were two things that very much do interlink with each other, but they were developed to some extent separately. And both of those seem to be having positive and negative impacts upon learners. And then at the same time, whilst teachers were trying to change everything that they've done in terms of previous work, we also had the global pandemic and the ongoing impacts of those as well. So just wanted to mention very briefly then, what do we mean when we're talking about additional learning needs in Wales? Now the terminology has changed, and we'll think a little bit about terminology later, but terminology has changed, however the definition hasn't changed that much. So a learner in Wales has an additional learning need if they have a learning difficulty or disability. Okay, and a learning difficulty or disability, that's not working, if they have a significantly greater difficulty in learning than the majority of others. Okay, so quite specific but also quite vague. What do we mean by significant? All right, and another key point is learners have ALN if their needs call for additional learning provision. So it's quite possible, for example, that a learner who is dyslexic is in their everyday mainstream primary school. If their needs are being met by the school's universal provision, in other words, what they offer to everyone, then in terms of that definition, they don't have an additional learning need. Okay, so some of the challenges that seem to have come out since the new system has been embedded is, what do we mean by this additional learning provision? Now in school, in all classes, generally teachers and teaching assistants are going to be differentiating work. So where does differentiation stop and where does something additional or different start? And a lot of schools, looking at support research recently, seem to be unsure in terms of that. And Welsh Government are now looking at evaluating the new changes in education in Wales, and that's one of their key things to look at, is what do they mean by this. Okay, now does that make a difference? It does when we look at the next slide. But just in terms of areas of need, I might have shown you this last week as well, I apologise if I'm repeating myself. But in terms of areas of need, 4 key areas of need that learners can experience, and it's worth noting as well that learners can have primary and secondary areas of need. So for example, one need might cause another. Equally, we might have learners who experience needs in multiple categories as well. So the first area of need, communication and interaction. Now speech, language, communication needs are the most common areas of need in Wales, especially in primary schools. And potentially we've seen a growth in this since the end of the pandemic, where children perhaps start in school with less vocabulary than they had previously. So was that a result of being that particular age during lockdown where you didn't get to go to nursery school, where you didn't get to spend time with extended family, where potentially you were at home with 2 working parents and perhaps you were put in front of Peppa Pig on an iPad for the majority of the day, for example. So lots of children, increasing numbers of children are starting school with communication and interaction needs. We can also put kind of neurodivergence and autism within this category as well. Cognition and learning, so someone had mentioned experience about dyslexia, for example, so very much goes into this particular box or column. So those learners who have a difference in terms of how they learn or how they process information. And when we think about cognition and learning needs, we can have needs like moderate learning difficulties. So those learners who are maybe 18 months behind their peers right across the curriculum. And then we can have those needs that are a bit more specific. Okay, specific learning differences like dyslexia, difficulty with language, dyscalculia, difficulty with numbers, dyspraxia, difficulty with bodily coordination, and dysgraphia, difficulty with physical handwriting, for example. Okay, there are some areas of commonality across all of those, in particular in relation to memory. And one of the challenges we have with specific learning difficulties in particular is there's all sorts of different criteria and traits and characteristics, and they might be common across all of those. So that learner who is dyspraxic might experience challenges with their reading and writing, and when they're tested, actually they are not dyslexic. that dyslexic learner might experience difficulty with maths because of the level of language that's involved in some math sums, for example. So if you think about some of the tests our children do in school, so I remember looking at a Year 6 SATs paper a few years ago, and there was a maths question which was along the lines of: a farmer has 10 cows that produce 20 litres of milk a day. How many litres of milk will his cows produce in a week? How many more litres of milk would they produce if he bought 2 more cows? Now basically all you had to do was 10 times 20 and then times it by 7, but there was an awful lot of literacy to get through in that sum. So potentially that dyslexic learner might have been impacted. They've just seen the words and kind of gone, no, I can't do that. Social, emotional and mental health difficulties then, so potentially ADHD might come into this bracket, but we're also looking at those learners perhaps who attend the unit that you mentioned on Friday. So we used to be looking at learners who had kind of social, emotional and behavioural difficulties. Potentially we might be looking at children with school anxiety, for example. We might be thinking about eating disorders and substance misuse here as well, for example. And then perhaps the one that's a little bit more straightforward to visualise, those children who've got a sensory and or a physical need. So there's a hearing impairment or a visual impairment or both, or a physical impairment. Okay? And when we're looking at learners with ALN, then learners with ALN will be placed into these different categories. And as we mentioned last week, and as we're going to mention a bit more this morning, those labels that we give them are powerful, because labels influence our perceptions and it influences self-perception as well. And I would say arguably there are perhaps some labels on there that are more positive than others. Or maybe there are some labels there that people view more negatively than others. So if as a teacher, for example, you know you've got a new student starting with you who is dyslexic, you might have a particular perspective about that. If you get told you've also got a new student starting with you who's got a social, emotional and behavioural difficulty, you might feel differently because you see that word difficulty and you see that word behaviour, and maybe you treat that learner differently, even on a subconscious level. So what's happened since we've changed things in Wales? So very quickly, first of all, the main reason that Welsh Government changed things was a recognition that many children and families weren't getting the support they needed. Now, that sounds like I'm kind of being damning towards teachers and schools there, and that's not my intention at all. There's all sorts of different factors which influence whether students get support or not, and there are some kind of key logistical ones like funding and resources, for example. So there was a recognition that some children weren't getting their needs identified, or they weren't getting their needs identified quickly enough, which meant they were perhaps disengaging in education, falling further behind whilst they were waiting for an assessment. So at one point, for example, I live in Pembrokeshire, further west, there was a 7-year waiting list for a dyslexia diagnosis. So that learner who's showing those traits and characteristics when they're 11, 12 years of age in secondary school, perhaps have finished education and actually are now moved into adult services before they've been diagnosed. Okay, and if we don't have a diagnosis, are we waiting for that before we put support in place? So, try to make things better. One of the key things that's come out of it is learners have more of a voice. So we listen to children more, we listen to families more. The new system is underpinned by person-centred practice, so doing things with learners, giving them a voice rather than doing things to learners, which perhaps many years ago education was guilty of. We're the experts, we'll do what we know is best for you, rather than asking, how would you like this to work, for example. So, one of the biggest outcomes is the number of learners with ALN in Wales has dropped. So this came into being in September 2021. Before that, just under 20% of all learners in Wales had SEN, as it was at the time. The most recent figures that have been published were from January this year, which shows just under 10%. And we've gone from nearly 93,000 learners with SEN in Wales to under 44,000 learners with ALN. Okay, so a big drop. So why is that the case? And no one is really quite sure. Now there's a few reasons why that might be. So some people think what we did before was over-identify SEN. Don't know whether I agree with that or not, but that is one school of thought. Another school of thought suggests that we've got less people identified with ALN. If we go back to that definition, because schools are not having to put additional provision in place. In other words, schools have become more inclusive in terms of better meeting everyone's needs. So if that's the case, that's a far more positive spin on what might be going on. Equally, another school of thought might be, do you know what, we are now counting numbers of children with ALN differently. So earlier on I said there was a moderate learning difficulties category. Up until 2021 we used to have a general learning difficulties category. So maybe those learners, I'm not quite sure how it was quantified, but were a little bit behind everyone else in their class. We don't count general learning difficulties anymore on school registers. So maybe there are different reasons why the numbers have gone down. So maybe we've just put one category in the bin, or schools have got better at supporting learners generally, which means they're not having to put extra things in place to meet needs, or maybe we'd counted too many learners as SEN previously. And there are quite entrenched perspectives in terms of which ones of those are right. Okay, so one of the things that does seem to be true, though, historically and still to today, is learners who have ALN or SEN are more likely to be excluded from school than learners who don't. Now, this is from a few years ago, this slide now. We don't have these different categories of support in school in Wales anymore. But learners with ALN potentially would like to think, to know what, we've identified this child needs support, so we're going to give them more support. But in some cases, what seems to happen is learners have been identified with needs and actually are now more likely to be excluded. And one of the key ones is those ones related to behaviour. Okay. So maybe we've now got this label of behaviour attached to this learner, and maybe that is an issue. Okay. Now, in terms of inclusion, inclusion is another area where there are all sorts of different perspectives to this. Now, thinking a little bit about kind of legislation, UNCRC says all children have a right to an education. The UNCRPD suggests that all children and young people have a right to an inclusive education. However, what we don't have is a standard perspective or definition as to what we mean by inclusion. And we could look at this in all sorts of different ways. Okay, so thinking about that comment somebody posted earlier on, all children should be in mainstream school, but maybe it's hard. Okay, now what we've got on the board here, this perhaps are some more historical perspectives towards where and how we teach some learners, and this perhaps is where we're aiming to be today. So if we think about these, they're not quite circles, but are they kind of elliptical shapes? So that blue circly shape, if we think of that as being mainstream school, so our everyday local primary, local secondary school. When we started to set schools up in kind of the Victorian period, children were expected to go to school to the age of 10, and then it was increased to the age of 11. It was still up until the age of 15 in the 1970s in the UK, for example. And I'm just going to kind of use terminology of the time. These green dots were normal children. Okay, so terminology of the time, normal children will be sent to everyday school. These other shapes around the outside then would be children we would see today as having ALN or SEN. So they were different in some way, but when we started with education, we didn't really have a place for those children in the system. So normal, everyday children, however you define that, would go to their normal everyday school. Those children who were different, we didn't offer them education at all. What we then started to see in kind of the 19-teens was the introduction of special schools. So mainstream school, still the big blue circle, the little blue circle now is a special school. So what we've now started to do is to set up schools specifically to teach special children. So children were now getting an education, but they were segregated. They were taught somewhere else. And we still see this to some extent today. Okay, so like you said about the unit, they were children from all different primary schools in Swansea. They would have been coming maybe from right across the county to get to that unit. Ysgol y Derry, if anyone's seen the special school documentary on BBC, which I think is awesome, those children get sent there from everywhere within kind of a 50-mile radius. So ALN children, we didn't educate them at one point. The perspective was, well, they're not going to be able to learn, what's the point? Recognition that that wasn't fair, so we started to see special schools. So these children were receiving an education, might be different, and it might be somewhere else. In the 1980s, following the Warnock report, for example, we started to see more integration. In other words, some of these special units are now being brought into mainstream school. And I think perhaps we see this increasingly today. We talk about specialist teaching facilities in some schools, for example. So that mainstream primary school, that's also got a unit attached. Or that secondary school, that's also got a nurture group attached, for example. So those learners are now in the big mainstream circle, but they've still got that boundary around them. They're still separated to some extent. So they're integrated into school. And then depending upon a lot of the definitions of inclusion, maybe where we're working towards is this top one. All learners, regardless of their needs, being taught together in the same school, potentially in the same class. Okay? However, and we'll look at a couple shortly, there are all sorts of different definitions. So, I'm sure we can all agree that exclusion one isn't good. I don't think there's any justification why anybody is not entitled to or couldn't or should not receive an education. Where things get a little bit more tricky, potentially in terms of inclusion, is does inclusion just mean that? Okay? Just because you were in the mainstream school, does it mean your needs are being met? If you're in the mainstream school, but you've been told off in class and you're now standing outside in the corridor, you're not learning anything. Are you actually being taught? You are in the mainstream school, but people don't have any expertise or resources to meet your needs. You are there, but are you being included? Here, those learners in that smaller circle, yes, they're definitely being separated, but if their needs are being met in that smaller setting, are they being included? So maybe it's a little bit more complicated in practice. Okay, so again, just trying to think about how perspectives influence people's outcomes, I suppose. Now, what I've got on the board there are 3 different definitions of inclusion. They're partial definitions, so I've taken bits and the highlighted bits on them, those are my highlights, they're not in the original definition. So a really influential report in the UK was the Warnock report in 1978. This is where we introduced the term special educational needs for the first time. Before that, we used to talk about children who are handicapped. Okay, suggested then that all children should be involved in a common enterprise of learning where everyone can learn best. And then she went on to say, this should be in mainstream school. And a lot of people, I think, stopped reading the definition at that point because it carried on to say, if the school can meet their needs and if this is what parents want. So maybe what we started to see for the first time in some cases was those learners who might have been taught somewhere separately previously now being brought back into that school. Second definition, this is one from UNESCO. And Ken, I'm just going to mention a bit at the end. It's the responsibility of the regular system to educate all children. In other words, all children should go to mainstream school. We shouldn't have special schools to teach some learners separately. So quite specific in terms of what it says. And then the third one, this is one from Welsh Government. And again, just looking at the bottom part, the inclusion of pupils involves much more than the placement in a mainstream or a special school. Okay, so just physically being somewhere doesn't mean that person's needs are being met, doesn't mean they're learning, doesn't mean they're being included. So when we're talking about all children have a right to an inclusive education, does it only mean that? And as somebody said, that might be quite difficult to achieve in practice for all sorts of different reasons. Arguably, could that be inclusion? Could that be inclusion? Okay, and different countries do things differently. Okay, so Italy, for example, has gone through a process of shutting down the majority of its special schools. Portugal has done the same. Republic of Ireland has recently shut down all its specialist autism schools and have now moved all autistic learners into mainstream because they suggested that it was against those learners' human rights to be taught separately. So, great in theory possibly, however, has it worked in practice? Have they gone to schools where staff didn't know what to do because they've never had to teach those learners before? Have they gone to a school which doesn't have an appropriate type of environment to meet their sensory needs, for example? Okay, so we've mentioned a little bit about inclusion, and I suppose this is kind of a nice diagram. There's all sorts of different versions of these that you've probably seen. What we talk about a lot sometimes is equal opportunities, treating everyone the same. Now, in that first diagram, all those learners, or all those people have been treated the same. They've all been given the same support to see over that fence. It works for one of them in the middle. The one on the left probably didn't need that support. The one on the right, that support hasn't been enough. So treating people the same maybe isn't where we should be. The second one then thinks a little bit about equality and equity. What we're doing now is not treating people the same, but meeting their needs. And then the third one goes, actually, rather than just trying to meet people's needs in terms of getting over the obstacles that are there, why don't we just take those obstacles away where we can? And you might have come across universal design for learning, for example, where what we can do is think about how we teach, what we teach, how we assess learners, and if we can take as many of those obstacles away at the start, then that's going to meet more learners' needs without having to do something like that to try and support. Okay, now again, great in theory, lovely in theory, maybe somewhere we're kind of in between that with a bit of that as well. Okay, so do terminology and labels matter? So we mentioned in the neurodiversity one last week that yes, they do. Labels are powerful and they have a lifelong impact on people, and I think we probably looked at this slide as well, different areas of needs that people had been identified with previously. Now some of these were very much of their time, some of these I think are very shameful when we look back at them now, and definitely would not be labels that we would be using today, but all of these were labels that children were commonly given. And these labels then would have influenced the perspective of the people who work with them in terms of what they could or couldn't do, for example, in terms of where they should be taught or not, and also will have an impact upon how the child sees themselves and how peers see the child as well. So, worst one you could have had at one point was idiot. So this was somebody recognised as having an IQ of 30 or less, which meant they were likely to be a danger to themselves or other people unless they were separated away to be cared for. Okay, now IQ today is a very contentious issue as well. What do we mean by intelligence? Is there only one type of intelligence? How do we measure it? Who says what type of intelligence, if there are multiple intelligences, are the most worthy, for example? This one I think really interesting, morally defective. Okay, this was a child who was seen as potentially becoming criminalised as they got older. So what we needed to do was lock these children away so that they didn't start to enter into criminality. A key group that were kind of given this definition as well were unmarried teenage mothers in the 1920s, 30s and 40s. So they must have been morally defective to realise that it was not right to get pregnant outside of marriage. Never really had morally defective given to the fathers of those children though, so very gender specific. Mentally defective, if we think about the word defective, if you buy a toaster and it's defective, you take it back, there's something wrong with it. Okay, so that deficit very much focuses on negative. Handicapped, still use this I think to some extent in parts of America, that child being uneducable. There's no point in sending them to the school because they're not ever going to be able to learn. Other ones, educationally subnormal. Okay, so sub, below. These children were seen as lacking the intelligence or ability to engage with everyday education. Very shameful episode in British history. I suppose we had this a lot in the 1970s, in particular with some of the Afro-Caribbean children who'd moved with their families from the Windrush generation. And started off in parts of London in particular, where someone had decided that these Afro-Caribbean children, without any evidence whatsoever, lacked the intelligence to go to school. And what they were doing was harming the learning of the white working class children that they were in school with. So what they did was send them somewhere different. And in many cases they were kind of physically and mentally and emotionally abused when they were there as well. So a lot of these labels can be challenging. Mentally retarded, for example, still see this in the USA. Okay, so labels can be powerful because they impact upon our perceptions. Now, what I've got on the slide are 3 people here. I haven't given you a label, but we all, to some extent, have our own unconscious biases, maybe. And on the slide, we've got 3 people. They are real people. One of these people is a philanthropist. So they made millions and millions and now spend their time using their millions for charitable works. One of these is a leading orthopaedic surgeon and in particular supports child surgery. And one of these has been in prison for large-scale fraud, and they were convicted and sentenced to 24 years in prison. Okay, so we've got kind of mixture of ethnicity and gender on the board there, perhaps lifestyle choices as well. So what I'd like you to think of, so if we go A, B, C, so give you a moment, which one of these people do you think is the philanthropist? Which one do you think is a leading orthopaedic surgeon? And which one of these was in prison for large-scale fraud? Okay, so if we pick the philanthropist first of all, okay, so made millions, gave a lot of it away to charity. Does anyone think person A is the philanthropist? Anybody think B? Anybody think C? Okay, so person C is a chap called Eddie Brown, who grew up in poverty in Baltimore and Philadelphia. I think his parents died when he was really young and he kind of moved between different family members, and a random anonymous donor paid for him to go to school and paid for him to go to university. And he went on and set up a massive investment banking chain in America, and him and his wife set up the Eddie Brown Foundation and now give millions of dollars every year to support disadvantaged youth across the city, for example. Okay, Second one, so we've either got A or B. One of these people is a leading orthopaedic surgeon. So, does anybody think A is an orthopaedic surgeon? Okay, 1 or B is an
I
orthopaedic.
think the stereotype would be B.
Yeah, you're right. So the stereotype would be B, but actually it is Dr. Sarah Gray, who is commonly known as the world's most tattooed doctor. She is an orthopaedic surgeon in Australia. I think she is kind of Australia's leading child orthopaedic surgeon as well. And she says one of the things she finds really challenging, and has always found challenging, when she's walked into the room as the surgeon, if there's been a male colleague with her, straight away people start talking to the male. And she says partly it could be because she was quite young at the time, she still is. She said partly it could be the way I look, partly it's because I'm a woman, people view me differently, they don't take me seriously. And she said she's had families, for example, who've gone, actually, I don't want you to operate on my child, purely because of the way she looks. Okay, and then the third one is a lovely chap called Jeffrey Skelling, who used to be the CEO of Enron, caused massive kind of environmental disasters in the 80s and 90s, and then he defrauded millions and millions of dollars out of it, but he looks a happy, smiley chap in the middle. Okay, so people's perceptions then are important, and that's quite a flippant way of looking at it, but potentially those labels that people have attached have similar kind of outcomes. Now, I've set the alarm to go off in about 30 seconds. What we're going to do when we come back from break is think a little bit about different views of disability. So we're going to think about the medical model of disability, the social model of disability, and I'm going to read you a story that you might have come across before called The Giraffe and the Elephant, which is a nice kind of analogy possibly for education systems, and that comment somebody mentioned earlier, maybe all children should go to mainstream school, but maybe it's difficult because of how mainstream schools have always been designed. Okay. So, I'll pause there for a break then. How long would you like to have for a break? 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
5 minutes is all right.
5 minutes, yep. So if we look to start back then just after 11, I'll just pause the recording before I forget. Right, okay, so we're coming up to 11:02 then if we're happy to start back. And what I'm going to do then, I'm going to read you a short story called The Giraffe and the Elephant, and I think this is quite a nice way of maybe trying to look at this and this to some extent. Okay, so it's kind of written like a child's fable, but what it's talking about, I suppose, is inclusion in society generally, but if we can kind of extrapolate that down to be in kind of schools, I suppose. Okay, so I'm going to have to read this out to you. So in terms of the metaphors, I suppose the house is the metaphor for a school. The giraffe, I suppose, is the metaphor for the majority of learners. In other words, those learners who don't have needs. And then the elephant is the metaphor for those learners who do. Okay, so in terms of the story then, I will read it out to you and then see what you think. So in a small community just outside of the city, there was a family of giraffes. They had worked hard to build themselves a new house with all their needs in mind. There were tall ceilings, tall doorways and high windows with lots of light and narrow hallways that saved space. It was such a wonderful house it won the National Giraffe House of the Year award. One day the head giraffe was working in their basement workshop when he looked out of the window and saw someone familiar. It was an elephant that he had worked with before on the local Parent-Teacher Association committee. Giraffe remembered that Elephant liked woodwork, and an exciting thought occurred to him. Maybe Elephant would like to come and work on some projects with me. So the giraffe stuck his head out the window and invited the elephant in. The elephant was delighted. He had liked working with the giraffe and thought that this would be the perfect way to get to know him better. He walked up to the basement door and waited for the giraffe to open it. So, Giraffe opened the door, greeted the elephant warmly, but then the two animals were faced with a problem. The elephant could get his head through the door, but he couldn't go any further because the door was too narrow. The giraffe, though, wasn't worried. He quickly explained to Elephant that the door could be expanded in order to accommodate some of the big woodwork projects he made. So, he opened a bolt, slipped open the panel, and the elephant was able to squeeze through the door. The two friends were happily exchanging stories after the phone rang. Giraffe saw it was his boss and told Elephant he needed to take the call. He said to the elephant to make himself at home whilst he went upstairs to his office to take the call and said, "I'm sorry, I might be a few minutes." So the elephant decided to take a look around the workshop and saw a half-finished project in the far corner and went over to take a look at it. As he walked through the doorway to get to the far side, he heard an ominous sound as his back end crunched up against the sides of the door frame. He tried to back out. He then decided he was going to go and join the giraffe upstairs, but as he walked up the stairs began to crack. He jumped off and hit the wall, making a huge dent. He sat there all dishevelled and feeling sorry for himself until the giraffe came back down the stairs. Giraffe was surprised and exclaimed, "What's going on here?" The elephant replied, looking slightly ashamed, "I was just trying to do what you said and make myself at home." The giraffe looked around his workshop and then smiled. "I see what's going on here," he said. "The doorway was too narrow for your large behind. What we need to do is make you smaller. There's an aerobic studio down the road, and if you go and take some classes, I'm sure we could get you to slim down to size." The elephant looked like he wanted to shrink into the wall that he had dented a few minutes ago and said, "Well, maybe." And the giraffe continued, "And the stairs are obviously too weak to carry your weight. So if you also go to disco dancing classes at night, I'm sure we can get you to a point where you are lighter on your feet. Can you do those things? It would be great if you could, because it would be nice to work together." "Perhaps," said the elephant, "but to tell you the truth, I'm not really sure that a house designed for a giraffe would ever really work for an elephant unless there were major changes." So I think that's quite a nice sort of modern fable potentially in terms of thinking about education, thinking about schools, thinking about who is expected to fit in, who is expected to adapt. And it goes back to that question earlier on, where should learners with needs be taught? Okay, so bear those kind of things in mind, I suppose. So we're going to go on now then very quickly to think a little bit about some of the different perspectives towards need. And you might have come across these cartoons before. They're by a chap called Crippen. And this is an artist who became paralysed after a motorcycle accident. And he does a lot of cartoons looking at about how society views disability, and very much from a disability point of view. And I think they are quite nice in terms of what they're trying to show. So again, we've got here maybe well-meaning woman, a little bit condescending, going along and patting this chap on the head. "So what's the matter with you, dear?" So in other words, what's wrong with you? And then they've gone, "Well, apart from your attitude and these barriers, nothing." So in other words, there's nothing wrong with me. The reason I have come against an obstacle is because you've put these steps there rather than a ramp, and you haven't thought about my needs. Okay? So, when we think about different models of disability that have informed education, there are many different models of disability, but the two main ones that have had an impact, I would say, are these two. So the first one, the medical model of disability. And the medical model of disability, not surprisingly, comes from the medical profession, sometimes known as the psychomedical model, so it comes from kind of psychology as well. And the aim of the medical model is to try and find out what is wrong with that person. So it's looking at trying to identify challenges the learner faces. But a key issue with this model is that it sees the learner as being the problem. Okay, so if you think about schools, you've got 35 children in a class, 30 of them are learning in the way that you would expect of them based on what you do. Some of them, though, aren't. So this model suggests, well, actually what we need to do is find out what's wrong with those children. Why aren't they learning? Because the other children are in that setting. Okay, and very much focuses on deficit, very much focuses on can't do. And what we tend here potentially is to think perhaps more negatively about the learner. And again, I can remember listening to teachers talking in the classroom, which I didn't go into very often because I didn't really identify with the teachers more than the learners when I was working there, in all honesty. But you used to have people talking about, well, you know whose brother that is, or you know what estate they live on, or do you remember who their mum was, or, you know, there's no way they're going to do their GCSEs because they've got such and such. So very much the focus is on deficit, focusing on difference, and what we tend to do with difference is push it away. So the expectation would have been those different learners would have been taught somewhere else. The social model then very much kind of focuses on that. Actually, the individual isn't the challenge. The challenge that individual faces is because there are barriers in their way that result from society. So rather than expecting the individual to change to get over those barriers, what we need to do is think about how do we remove those barriers so that all individuals are able to access what we're trying to do. Okay, so maybe the social one is thinking a little bit more about inclusion in the sense that what we'll do is we will adapt and be flexible to try and meet our learners' needs, rather than the medical model saying there's something wrong with that person, they're damaged or defective or faulty in some way. So what we need to do is send them somewhere different so that they don't get taught with normal children, for example. So maybe we do see more of a move from that to that today. However, by themselves, neither of them is perfect. Both of those kind of models have got advantages and disadvantages. So I'm going to speed up a little bit now. So what we're going to think a little bit about as we go through this morning is some of these contentious issues. All right, so is it an advantage for learners to have a label? Should all learners be taught together in the same place? And how should we put support in place for learners? So I'm going to ask you to take a look at this set of questions, and I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to think about and post something very briefly on here. So some of you have worked in schools, some of you might have had voluntary experience in schools. One of the things we do in schools is we put children together in some way. So we group learners in all sorts of different ways. Now, most commonly, for example, we do that by age. So if you were born between the 1st of September one year and the 31st of August the year after, you will be in the same age group class. So my birthday is the 27th of August. I was in the same class as people who were born the September the year before. So I was the youngest learner in my class. If I was born a week later, I'd have been the oldest person in the year below. So we group learners in all sorts of different ways. Okay, now some of those might be logistical. Some of those might be done for specific reasons. So what I'd like you to think of very quickly is what are the different types of ways that we group learners in schools that you know of? Might there be advantages and different disadvantages in terms of those? Okay, so thinking about, I suppose, in UK schools we have, apart from the age bit, two main focuses. One of them is mixed ability groups. So all children of that similar age being taught in class together. And sometimes we have ability grouping. So we put learners together, so maybe those more able learners sit together on that one table. Those learners who need a bit more support might sit together on that table. All right. So are there any potential groupings that you are aware of? Okay, and there are all sorts of different things as well. So we could have learners who are in a particular unit, for example, or we mentioned nurture groups earlier on. So those children have been taken out of class to go and be taught somewhere separately because of the kind of emotional challenges they face being in school. All right. Now, in terms of what we're talking about for the next few minutes, there is no right or wrong answer in terms of this. I suppose it comes back to it's a matter of perspective. But all these things do definitely have an impact, either positively or negatively, upon children and young people. Okay. And I would say in education there is no one right answer for everything. There is no one-size-fits-all approach that works. But what we're trying to do perhaps is include all children into the same system in different ways. All right. So what are the different types of groups that you're aware of? What might be the advantages of being taught in one type of group? Are there potential disadvantages of being taught in the same type of group? Okay. Maybe the answer comes down to it depends on each individual learner. Okay. So I'll give you another minute or so just to type something briefly on there. I won't show the Padlet for now because I'm conscious of time, but we'll come back to it later on. All right. So learner grouping, how do we place children together in schools? Now it might depend on the type of school. It might be different in primary school compared to secondary school, for example. It might be different in a primary school that's got 40 children compared to a primary school that's got 500 children. Okay. And there's all sorts of factors that could impact. Okay, quite common schools in Wales, for example. Some schools might have a Welsh medium class and also an English medium class. So people could be split by language ability or language choice. So whilst you're doing that, does anybody just want to kind of shout out different kind of groups that you're aware of?
Ability-based group and mixed ability group then.
Fab, thank you very much. So yes, so it could be in secondary school, for example, we put those high achieving learners into a higher ability class for everything, and they kind of follow through, which also means we've got those lower ability groups in a lower ability class. Maybe we've got mixed ability groups, so perhaps we see that a bit more in primary school possibly. So you're in that class because of your date of birth rather than any other reason. Some secondary schools have a kind of a mixture of both. So you might be in a mixed ability class, but then you might be set for certain areas of the curriculum. And what many schools tended to do was put people into ability groups for the core subjects as they were at the time, English, maths, science and possibly Welsh. However, what some schools tended to do was put people into ability groups based on their experience in just one subject. So that person who might be in a lower ability group for English might also be in a lower ability group for maths. But they might be higher ability in terms of their maths level, but because of timetabling and logistics, they're put in that lower ability group for everything. Some challenges learners face, for example, increasingly seeing kind of refugee asylum seeker children in the UK, a growth in Wales, and it's very small numbers compared to other parts of the UK, where children who have English as an additional language. Very often those learners are put into lower ability groups. Okay, purely based on the fact that they speak a different language at least the majority of the time, rather than their ability. So might there be any potential advantages or disadvantages in terms of putting people into different ability groups? Okay, so if you were in a higher ability group, for example, might there be benefits of that for you? Or might there be disadvantages for you?
I think children like are very aware of, like, even when they're like obviously set in tables of ability in the classroom, they're already aware of that and how that relates to their relationship with the teacher, and they hear that with feedback as well.
Yeah.
And they can also see if other children need that support from like TAs and stuff. I think children, they do just like gain those assumptions that, oh, these people need extra help, whether that's positive or negative, but they're aware of it.
Thank you. I think that's a great point, and I think that key bit there's children are very much aware, and I think in schools I went to secondary school and we had class A, B, C, D and E, and that was very obvious what that meant, but we now have classes with less obvious names. You might be in group, or the red group, for example, compared to the blue group, but you still know realistically where you fit into that hierarchy or that ability hierarchy.
What about mixed ability group?
So mixed ability group, again, there are all sorts of different arguments whether that's effective or not. So some people will say yes it is, and you know what, we live in a mixed ability society, therefore it's beneficial if children are taught in mixed ability groups because everyone's got different strengths and weaknesses, and at times it's worth learning about those things from each other. And you know what, you might be lower ability in that particular area, but today this is your area of strength, so you shine within that group, so everyone is seen as being kind of on an equal playing field. But then other people will go, well actually no, mixed ability groups aren't great for all learners either, because again people are now very much aware of those differences. So I'm sitting in that mixed ability group, but that person who's sitting next to me, I can see they're much further ahead with their work than I am. So does that mean I'm daft, or does that mean I'm stupid? So there's no right answer, I don't think, in terms of this. Again, it's that kind of matter of opinion and perspective, but it does definitely impact upon that learner. So maybe that learner who's in the higher ability group, does that have a positive impact on your self-esteem? Well, people see me as being smart and intelligent, therefore I feel good about myself. That learner who's in bottom set maths, I think it's quite difficult to get that same positivity out of it, because do you feel deficient or lesser compared to your peers? So it can be quite a fine line, I suppose. And I'm just going to mention very, very briefly now some research which looked at some of this. So this was a project by Welsh Government thinking about what schools were doing just after the pandemic in terms of how they set learners or not. And in particular, they were looking to see whether, we had to teach people differently during the pandemic. Were there lessons to learn from that which might come back into the classroom now things were going back to whatever normal means? And I've put a hyperlink to the paper on there which should work. But a couple of things came out across primary and secondary schools. The main ways children were put together was either in mixed ability groups, but in some cases they were put into ability groups for certain subjects. So you're in a mixed ability class to do geography and history, because it's only geography and history, but in English, that's a more important core subject, we're going to put you into ability groups.
I think in primary school, it's easy to put, it works better in lessons like topic,
Yeah.
where the outcome is broad when you're learning about knowledge and the subjects. Whereas in English and maths, because you're trying to get children to meet the outcome to be able to go on to the next thing in the curriculum, it's a lot harder to do mixed ability group.
It is, and I would agree with you in terms of that. I think
it works
that's
really nicely in, in topic lessons with groups.
Yeah. And I think in terms of the new curriculum for Wales now, where we've moved away perhaps from those siloed subjects, does that make mixed ability more relevant? I don't know, but that's an excellent point in terms of that. And if you were doing an assignment on that, that would be a perfect thread that would go through. All sorts of different reasons teachers said why they put children into different groups, but one of them was very much like you said. We're trying to teach a particular set of competencies, and it's easier if we've got a group where everyone's on a similar level. Okay, so if I'm teaching maths and we're doing something where I've got 5 learners don't understand 2 times 5, but I've also got 5 other learners in the class who are doing complex algebra, it's very difficult to meet everyone's needs together as a mix. So maybe, like you said, in that type of setting by ability could work better. Other people would argue, well, you know what, those learners being mixed abilities will help pull each other up. Okay, I've kind of got some sympathy for that, but that's putting a lot of pressure on those learners to help bring their peers up as well. Other findings that came out from this study, teachers felt was really important to put people in these groups, and they wanted to build children's confidence and self-esteem. What the report, I think, found, which perhaps was a little bit unexpected, was some of these learners, especially in what were seen as being lower ability groups, actually liked being in those groups as well. And they liked being in those groups because they felt that their needs were perhaps being better met. Do you know what, I'm in a smaller group of 10, we all seem to be doing the same kind of work rather than sitting there watching 20 other people rushing ahead. So they felt that there were some benefits of that, but they also came out with some negatives as well. One of them was a lack of movement between groups. Do you know what, I might have been in lower ability set for maths in year 7, but I'm in year 9 now, and actually I'm kind of average in terms of maths because my ability is developed. However, I'm still kept in that bottom set. So why hasn't my grouping moved with my progress? Or in some cases, some schools were kind of putting people in general ability sets when actually they might have been really, really good in that, have a weakness in that, but they were in the lower group for everything. So is that fair either? And then the key thing that came out, I suppose, for me being really important was that how it impacted upon identity. If you are in that lower set, you know, no matter what that set is called, that that is where you are. That's quite difficult, I think, to take positives from. So some of the learners talked about stigma, either coming from their peers, okay, and there's a couple of quotes that came out to what you're in the thick class, or in some cases they felt teachers saw them differently, and in some cases they'd internalised that themselves. I'm in that class because I'm stupid. So, potential advantages and disadvantages. Now there's some quotes on there, I'm not going to go through these now because of time, but this is a maths teacher, for example, very much said really what you just said about if you've got people in sets, it's easier perhaps to give them work that's on a similar standard for everyone rather than having that range of ability in the class. Okay, I'm just going to be really annoying and flick through these really quickly. Students then, some of the teachers said they don't like being in the lower classes because there's that stigma. What did the learners say? This one I thought was interesting. I like being in those classes because the teachers are more respectful of me in that class, and because of that I respect them back. Okay, another learner talked about the fact I felt more confident because in that class there's more support. So we need more support, so there's more support in there, so I feel better. And then someone else had talked about, well, that class is now quite small, and I like being in that small class because I don't have to wait for the teacher to see 10 other people before they come and see me. There's only 10 of us in the class, and there's 2 teaching assistants and a teacher, and it's just easier to get the support. But this was the negatives then. We get called names because we're in that class. They felt and were made to feel lesser than their peers, and these were some of the words they used. We're in that class because we're dumb or we're weirdos. Okay, or the most positive, and it's not the most positive, but the most positive wording for it, we must be there because we're not the most clever. That was the nicest terminology they used to define themselves. And then I think this is interesting. I don't like the teachers showing who is intelligent and people who are not. So they didn't like when they were in classes the fact that being in certain classes had identified them as being intelligent or being stupid as they saw it. But equally, those things happen in a general, everyday, mainstream mixed ability class as well, possibly. So what did these learners want teachers to know? They liked the fact that some classes had more support. Some of these learners, although they didn't like being in a lower ability class, didn't want to go back into classes that were bigger because they felt they would miss out on the support. One of the things they did really miss was spending time with friends sometimes. So they talked about the fact, well, we're all here in this class because we have same levels of difficulty, not because we're friends with each other. And also, they wanted teachers to kind of hear more about their voice and what they thought about classes as well. Okay, so that's where I thought we were going to have got to earlier on. Just going to spend kind of 10 minutes looking at this and then 10 minutes looking at the next bit. So one of the most common sources of support schools tend to give in terms of inclusion and working with learners with ALN or SEN is teaching assistants. Now, teaching assistants have a large number across the UK. Now, these figures are from 2022. There are more updated figures, but they're a little bit vague. The most recent ones I've seen suggest there are over 400,000 teaching assistants in schools across the UK. Okay, now many schools have had teaching assistants for years. In the 1960s, we started to see what were called welfare assistants. And these people would come into class, and this was a quote from a politician at the time, welfare assistants would come in, wipe up the snot, and clean away the paint pots at the end of the day. In other words, they were seen as being more of a dog's body for the teacher. They were an extra pair of hands to have in the classroom. That child needs to go to the toilet, that child's been sick, this needs to be photocopied. They will do those things and allow the teacher to get on with teaching. In the 1990s, we started to see what was called Mum's Army. Okay, so very often and stereotypically, but true, the vast majority of teaching assistants are female. Many of these were kind of local mums or perhaps mums who had children in that school who were looking for a term-time job they could work around school holidays. And what we tended to see was, at the time, these roles were very informal. There was no real expectation in terms of qualifications, in terms of teaching assistants. Today, this has become a more competency-based profession, and perhaps more of a profession than it used to be. However, teaching assistants still potentially in the classroom, or not potentially, but are definitely still the least paid in class, potentially have the least amount of agency, potentially have the lowest status. I'd lost count of the number of times I would hear people saying things, I don't need to listen to you, you're only the teaching assistant. And in some cases, potentially depending upon how schools ask them to work, these are the people that are asked to be working with the most challenged or challenging learners, potentially have the least support, least qualifications, least training and least voice to be able to do that. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do very briefly, I'm not going to ask you to post this onto the Padlet unless you want to, but I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to think about teaching assistants in the classroom. Okay, so some of you have been teaching assistants, some of you have worked with teaching assistants. If teaching assistants, that extra person in the classroom, is one of the biggest responses schools have in terms of supporting learner needs, what are the potential advantages and disadvantages of that to the learner? Okay, is it beneficial for you to have a teaching assistant, or is it a disadvantage? And this second question, do teaching assistants support inclusion, or do they get in the way of inclusion? Now, I've worded it that way for a specific reason. And then I'm going to show you, so there's quite a damning report or a link to it a little bit later on. Could teaching assistants, or how could teaching assistants be best used within the classroom? So those of you that have been in the role or worked with people in the role, think about what that might have looked like. So were you a one-to-one teaching assistant where you spent all your day working with a specific child? Were there advantages or disadvantages of that? Were you a teaching assistant, or have you worked with a teaching assistant who supports a small group of children? Might that have a different impact in terms of how that's done? Were you or have you worked with a teaching assistant that's attached to a whole class? Does that work and look different? Okay, and one thing I should have said going through this, I suppose these people have different names for their role as well. So 1960s welfare assistants, up until probably the 20-teens, and we still see this today, LSAs, learning support assistants. Today, more commonly see the term teaching assistants. Scotland, for example, talk about assistant support professionals. So different terminology again. So are these people in the classroom to support welfare? Are they there to support learning? Are they there to support teaching? Okay, and I'm going to give you about 90 seconds, and I'm going to do one of those things, give you a task and not give you enough time to do it. So I just want to show you a very brief video which made me think on my practice in terms of teaching assistants and how we ask teaching assistants to work and how I was asked to work in that role as well. Okay, so are there advantages and disadvantages of having a teaching assistant? Do teaching assistants help the child and help inclusion, or do they unintentionally hinder that child and their learning and inclusion? What might be the best ways of using teaching assistants in the classroom? Okay, so I can hear people are typing away. All sorts of debates around this. So people come out with things like, it's helpful to have a teaching assistant because that teaching assistant can kind of translate the teacher's instructions for you into language that you understand. Or it's helpful to have that teaching assistant because they help keep you on track in class. Or that teaching assistant in class is supporting that particular group of learners, which means the teacher can support the rest of the children in the classroom. So all sorts of different reasons why people might have teaching assistants. In terms of whether teaching assistants help or hinder inclusion, I'll show you a video shortly, which, as I said, made me think. And then in terms of reports about teaching assistants, just going to mention this report very quickly from the Education Endowment Foundation, the EEF, from 2015. And this is kind of an independent research organisation in England which focuses on education. And as I said, I think this sounds quite damning about teaching assistants. So their report said, the way in which teaching assistants are typically asked to use does not lead to improvements in pupils' academic outcomes. I don't think I agree with that fully, but I think what they were saying there is not the teaching assistants are doing a bad job, but how they're being asked to work could be more effective. There is some evidence that shows teaching assistants help what they call soft skills. So they help keep people on task, for example. But a challenge might be learner dependency. So that learner depends on you being there. Once you are not there, do they have the independence to be able to work, or the confidence to be able to work without your support sitting next to them? More positive, it definitely helps teacher workloads, but are they there to support the teachers, or are you there to support the learners? Or is it some kind of combination of those things? And then very much agree with this last point, teaching assistants don't get enough training or recognition or support for the role that they are doing. Okay, it is very common in the school that I worked in, for example, that the work that you were being expected to help a teacher with learners in the class during the day, you'd find out the same time as the pupils were doing it. Okay, at the end of the day, teacher told you what they thought, did they actually listen to your experience? Okay, so maybe there's something about how we ask teaching assistants to work. So I'm just going to show you this very brief video, and then what we're going to move on and think a little bit about is whether there are some children that perhaps are a bit more difficult to include in mainstream schools compared to others. Okay, so hopefully this one works.
I don't understand why I'm at the back of the class. I wish I was like everyone else. I want to do what they're doing. But here I am, doing the same old number activity, watching as my classmates learn something else. Don't they know that they're setting me up to fail? Don't they know they hold my future in their hands? I want to work with my class, learn what they are learning, and do the activities they do. But here I am, stuck at the back, limited by low expectations. Having a one-on-one teacher aide just teaches me to rely on them and means I get less attention from the teacher. I am not included in the classroom. I am in the same room but segregated from my peers, sat to the side or back, working on different things and missing out. I want to be free to learn with my peers, reach my full potential and be seen to be like everyone else. I need something to change. You may be wondering what was wrong with this picture. I am in the classroom with my peers, sitting in my seat, learning the same things as everyone else. You may think this is inclusion, but it's not. I am stifled, limited, and held back from reaching my full potential. Though I love my teacher aide, I don't get to think for myself. In fact, a lot of the time, my teacher aide does it for me, even whispering the answer in my ear when I already know it. The more she is with me, the more I realize that there is no point in me thinking for myself because she will give me the answer anyway. I'm sure there are other kids who also need her help. Does she need to be with me? Can't she help others? Surely if I need help, I can put my hand up and ask my teacher like my friends do. My friends and classmates want to help me, but by having someone right next to me, they can't. I need to learn from my peers, be able to do group work and be challenged. I want to be allowed to fail or succeed and learn from it. I need something to change. Can you find me in the crowd? Inclusion is more than just a word. It is a culture, a mindset, and an expectation that everyone can and will learn and succeed along their age-appropriate peers. I know it can be challenging to include me in the learning as sometimes I might require extra resources and information, but giving me space to learn from my teacher and peers is the best way to challenge me and allow me to grow. I want to learn the same things as my classmates, and I want teachers to have the same expectations of me as my friends. My learning may need to be modified, but I still want the opportunity to show what I can do, not focus on what I can't. Treat me the same as any other student and watch me flourish. I will rise to the challenge of expectations you set for me. Are you ready to really include me?
Okay, I'll pause that there. I think that's quite a powerful short video, realistically, and it made me think about how I worked and how teaching assistants worked with learners as well. And I think there's all sorts of things that came out in terms of that, in terms of perceptions, in terms of what we think the learner can do, those expectations. Did those impact upon that child in the classroom and how she was being supported? Was the teaching assistant, especially in that middle part, quite well-meaningly but given too much support? Did that have a negative impact on the learner even though what she was trying to do was positive in nature? Okay, I'm very conscious of time, so the last thing I'm going to ask you to look at is a little bit of this video, And what I'm going to ask you to think a little bit about here is perceptions of some learners and whether, going back to that debate around all learners should be together in mainstream school, are there some learners that are perhaps more challenging or more difficult to be in that setting? Now I'm just going to show you a brief bit of this clip. It's from a film that came out in 1995 called Clockwork Mice. And I've seen this film twice in my life. One time in 1995 when I was doing my PGCE, when I felt really, really sorry for the teacher in terms of this clip we're going to see. And in my last week of teaching in the PRU, before I went into kind of higher education, I saw it again, and it made me laugh really in terms of how much my perspective of the situation had changed and where my sympathies lay those many years later. So I'm just going to show you this clip. I will apologise in advance, it's got some slightly fruity language in it. But this is a clip which I can identify with in all sorts of different ways, because the very first week I taught in the pupil referral unit, something very similar happened to me, and looking back on it at the time, it was to do with my perception of what those learners could do, which influenced my practice. In other words, I was told that these learners can't do this, so don't give them work that's any higher than that. I've listened to that advice. I went in trying to be positive and well-meaning, and they basically told me which hole I could shove it in, and then kind of all escaped out of various windows and things in the room as well. So, thinking a little bit about perceptions, should all learners or could all learners be taught together in the same school?
Smile. Into schools, home background, police report. It's not a soft Oxford teaching one boy, you know. Hello there. It's Neil, isn't it? You've got an hour and a half with me today. So what do we do then, eh?
Basketball!
I think we just had a basketball lesson with Miss Pollard, haven't you?
So?
Well, so, what do you mean, so? You can't play basketball all day now, can you?
Why not?
All right, Rosie.
Will that come back?
We can picture that.
Can I help you? Right, you put the drawing away, you go back to your own lesson. Okay, Neil, where does your teacher give your exercise books?
I ain't doing any writing. I want to play basketball.
Yes, well, I've just said you can't.
You shit! I do not know your shit!
All right, Neil, just calm down. Calm down, Neil. Please. Be reasonable, Neil. Put the chair down. Please. Window. Come on now, Neil. Look here. Neil! Neil?
You took it!
Okay, I will stop it there because of time. Okay, so one of the things we were talking about this morning, and I think we've tried to cover probably too much in the session, but realistically what we've been trying to think a little bit about is how perceptions influence how children are taught, where children are taught, and what their outcomes might be as a result of that. So I think you raised some really good points in terms of is there an advantage in terms of being in a mixed ability group or setted group, for example. Again, I haven't looked at what you'd posted, but I could see people were typing things about the teaching assistant, and I think that short video was really powerful in terms of how we ask that person to work. And then the final bit then, and this one is a contentious one in terms of thinking back to where and how should children be taught. If inclusion just means that, what could be the advantages or disadvantages or the difficulties of supporting learners like Neil in that setting? Potentially for some learners with some needs, is that more appropriate? Or might that be more appropriate? Okay, now that film I think is a really interesting film. If anyone wants to follow that up, it is on YouTube. It does have some happy endings as you kind of go through, and it picks up very much on what somebody else said earlier on, getting to know the learner and building those relationships so that they feel a sense of belonging is what really comes out in terms of that. So it's 11:48. We've kind of done some of what I was going to talk about with you today. Some of it we've run out of time, which is my fault. Before we finish, does anyone have any particular questions or any points you want to raise in terms of anything from this morning? Other than stop talking, old man. But other than that, is that the kind of aim, hopefully we've got to it to some extent, is to think about if we give people labels to inform support, those labels are powerful, they influence our perspectives. Okay, that learner in the Down syndrome clip was talking about, I need people to have high expectations of me. Do we see some labels and think more negatively? Okay, Neil's labels we find out in the film are very much to do with kind of trauma and adverse childhood experiences which display as behaviour. Do we feel more negative about those children or those needs because they're more difficult, they're hard for us to deal with? And there we go, that's the alarm gone, so I would stop talking. So other than that, thank you very much for indulging me and engaging with the Padlets this morning. Hopefully there's something that's come out that's been interesting this morning. I don't think there's anything that specifically fits in with your assignment that's due in next week or this week, but you never know.
We could hold the next one, no? We could use this for the next one.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, so I think in terms of that one, so you've got you've looked at different kind of case study areas, I suppose, haven't you? So I think, you know, it's a really interesting area, in my opinion, ALN or SEN. I think these are some of the most challenging, but picking a word somebody said earlier on, fabulous learners in school as well. And I think some people like working with these types of learners, other people don't. And I think it's unfortunate that those people who don't miss out, I think, on all sorts of things in their career, but equally, do we give teachers enough training and enough support and enough resources and enough time to be able to look at these effectively as well? As I think we said before, every single area of need is a master's degree in its own right, realistically. So it is difficult. Here we go. So I'll stop talking. I will stop the recording there.